Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Caste in the United States, Voices from the Frontlines. Thank you for taking your time out and being here today. I do want to begin with a land acknowledgement. We're here today at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place the nation has called Dejo since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly, but unsuccessfully, sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. We acknowledge the circumstances that led to the forced removal of the Ho-Chunk people and honor their legacy of resistance and resilience. This history of colonization informs our work and vision for a collaborative future. We recognize and respect the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation and the other 11 First Nations within the boundaries of the state of Wisconsin. Our event today is organized by the Wisconsin South Asians for Justice and the School of Human Ecology Anti-Racist Action Group. The SOHI GSO Anti-Racist Action Group was formed in the fall of 2020 to support efforts to identify and address racist structures on campus and beyond. The event has been made possible due to funding from the Institute for Regional and International Studies National Resource Center, the Department of Geography, and the University Lecture Kemper KNAP Fund. I have the pleasure of speaking here on the behalf of the Wisconsin South Asians for Justice, or WISAJ as we fondly call it. WISAJ started in March 2020 as a progressive social justice advocacy group constituted primarily by South Asian students, faculty, and alumni of UW-Madison. Working together, we've been able to make some significant strides, including passing an ASM legislature to add caste as a protected category to the UW system-wide anti-discrimination policy, which is an ongoing effort. As part of our advocacy work, we also have some upcoming events, including some film screenings next month in April. We'll be sending out more details on that in the coming weeks and hope to see many of you there to support this work. Today's lecture also marks a significant moment for us as it is our inaugural event on caste education. As a reminder on the format of this webinar, we'll have presentations from both speakers and then move into a moderated Q&A with time for audience questions. If you have questions in general or addressed to a specific speaker, we ask that you post them through the Q&A box, as we do have several folks checking them as we go along. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Darshana Mini, who will be introducing our speakers and moderating the session. Dr. Mini is Assistant Professor of Communication Arts here at UW-Madison, and she has been an unrelenting supporter of our work and a generous mentor to us here at WISAJ for a long time. We're so glad to have her introduce our opening lecture. Darshana.
Thank you, Vibhulia, and it's a pleasure to actually have this session. And we have been part of a lot of conversations regarding what should be the inaugural event that look like, and we are so glad to have two eminent speakers with us. So just to give a few initial thoughts on why we should consider caste as a social category and its implication for Dalit, Adivasi, Bahujan communities, or historically marginalized from accessing educational resources. So for those who are relatively new to the idea of caste, caste can be defined as a system of rigid social stratification characterized by hereditary status, endogamy, and social barriers sanctioned by custom, law, and religion. It comes from the Spanish and Portuguese word casta, which means race, lineage, or breed, and was first used by the colonialists to refer to the social stratification that they witnessed in South Asia. Caste is inherited from the family one is born into and is unalterable throughout that person's life. Caste to a great extent determines access to opportunities for advancement, as well as ownership to resources, including education, land, and employment. So caste can be a very complex and hidden process, but it's invisibilized for those who come from upper caste background. But on the other hand, for those who are coming from the caste oppressed background, the impact of caste conditions their very social existence. Caste can be identified through a person's surname, food habits, and it aligns closely to prohibitions around touch, proximity, and the space that they occupy. So access to educational spaces has been a struggle that many Dalit students, Adivasi students who come from historically marginalized communities have faced for a very long time. And it is in this context that creating a safe and inclusive space that can protect the communities who are vulnerable. And I think this is a legal, moral, and ethical obligation that institutions have to offer to safeguard the rights. So in the recent past, Indian government has been taking a very stringent action in terms of what are the subjects that people from Dalit, Adivasi, Bahujan backgrounds can pursue for foreign institutional scholarships. And recently the government even came up with a notification which said that topics related to Indian culture cannot be pursued if you are on a fellowship and wanting to study in foreign institutions. So we know that there is a kind of institutionalization where there is a erasure of Dalit, Adivasi, Bahujan experiences in the South Asian community. And that is where this particular panel and the conversations on caste as protected category seems important. And we have here with us two wonderful speakers, and I want to introduce both of them to you. Firstly, we have Thenmozhi Soundararajan, who is a Dalit rights artist, technologist, and theorist. Currently, Thenmozhi is a co-founder and executive director of Equality Labs, a Dalit civil rights organization that uses community outreach, cultural and political organizing, popular education, and digital security to build power and end caste apartheid, white supremacy, gender-based violence, and religious intolerance. The main report that Equality Lab has come out with in 2018 called Caste in the United States, a survey of caste among South Asian Americans that became like the first comprehensive survey that documented the extent to which caste has embedded itself in the United States. So if you haven't gotten a chance, please visit Equality Lab's webpage and you have the report that you can download from there. The second speaker we have for today is Dr. Rajesh Sampath, who is an associate professor of philosophy of justice, rights, and social change at Brandeis University. His teaching interests include critical race theory and intersectionality, and he is a lead investigator of the program on social exclusion at the Heller School's Center for Global Development and Sustainability. He's involved in a number of diversity, equity, and inclusion committees and initiatives across the university, and he was part of a group of faculty who worked towards establishing an anti-caste discrimination policy at Brandeis University, paving the way for several other universities to follow. It's my pleasure to welcome you both to the event. And just as a reminder to the format of the webinar, we'll have both the speakers speak for roughly around 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll go to a moderated Q&A session with time for audience questions. So if you have any questions in general addressed to the specific speaker, we ask that you post them through the Q&A box or chat anytime, as there are several folks checking them as we go along. So thank you so much. And we have our first speaker, Thenmozhi Soundararajan. Over to you, Thenmozhi.
Thank you so much, Darshana, for that warm welcome, and also for all of the organizers that have really brought forward this conversation around caste equity to this campus. It's such a critical conversation, and it's such an honor to be able to be here as we move forward this crucial civil rights front for caste oppressed people and really all Americans. So again, my name is Thenmozhi Soundararajan, and I'm Executive Director of Equality Labs. And a lot of what I'm going to be speaking about today is about how does a system like caste, which has its origins in South Asia, find itself here in North America, and what are the things that we can do to address this in terms of the civil rights harms that we're seeing. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll also hit the present button. So we are good to go here. And, again, I think what's so important, and just building off of that definition that Darshana spoke about, is that caste apartheid is a structure of oppression that affects over 1.9 billion people around the world. And this exclusionary system, ranks people at birth, with one's caste determining every aspect of their life, from who they marry, the job that they have, where they worship, where they can live. And what's critical is that caste is a system of exclusion, analogous to race and other systems of exclusion that you might be more familiar with on campus. And so we need to, treat it not with a lack of competency, but with the same ways that we address other systems of exclusion, which means we need to have, training around it. We need to have policies, and we need to be able to create data to be able to understand what are the harms caste oppressed people are facing, and how can we move towards greater equity and access for those stakeholders on campus. And I think some of the ways that we can begin to build competency is to understand a little bit more about the origins of caste. And I think what's important is that we see caste most predominantly manifest in immigrants who are of South Asian backgrounds. And South Asian Americans, come from countries of origin that include Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar. And it also crucially includes people who were indentured from these communities. So, Indo-Fijian, Indo-Caribbean, Indo-African communities, all of those peoples also experience caste. So in a university setting, you might have students that are foreign, that are, first generation learners coming to the United States for the first time who, are experiencing caste. But you also may have people like me who are second generation. My parents immigrated here and I experienced caste amongst the diaspora and my peers. And I think it's very important that for the EEOC offices of the campus and anyone who's responsible for cultures of belonging, to know that you have a wide span of people that it impacts. Because even beyond South Asians, there are many communities across the world that have systems of exclusion that are based on descent and work that would also avail themselves of the category of caste. And so just being able to build some of that competency makes a huge step forward in being able to understand how it's impacting your campus today. And just to look at the stakes, and, I need to change that data because the last time I did that, again, there are 1.9 billion South Asians in the world, and in the United States, there's 5.4 million South Asians. So it's just with South Asians alone. So it's a significant amount of people that we're talking about, and, that I think really, would be useful to be able to spend some time in, better exploring. Now, when we talk about the caste system, the caste system as it originates within South Asia has a common blueprint, and there'll be like regional specializations, across the region. But what's the general template is that you usually have castes at the top that are the priests. And then underneath that, you have following castes, like you have Kshatriyas who are warriors, Vaishyas that are merchants, Shudras that are peasants. And all of these castes within this hierarchy have degrading levels of purity. So the people at the top are the most pure and have the most access to structural resources. And as you go down, you see more and more castes whose professions are seen as being ritually polluting, and more, therefore, the platform for them being excluded from society. And so I think within this system, the people who are considered outside of this system because they're outcasts are the castes that were seen as formally untouchable. And again, as someone who comes from those castes, we don't use the term untouchable because it's an epithet. Basically, they called my people untouchable because to touch us was to become spiritually defiled. And that in many ways that we did not have dignity towards God. And nobody really gets to say who is, what their role with the divine is. And that's why we, push away the word untouchable and instead use words like Dalit or our religious affiliation to escape that system. And Dalit means one who is broken, but also one who is resilient. And it's a political terminology because as we are communities that were forced into the worst of occupations, like we were the ones that had to clean up the shit of other castes. We were the ones that had to, dispose of the carcasses of dead animals. We also did the burial rites for people. And instead of, our work being valued, our humanity being responded to with dignity, we were actually condemned to an apartheid, where we live separate lives. We have separate places of worship, separate ghettos where we are forced to live. And we experience punishing systemic violence and accompanying impunity. And so, when we talk about this system, we don't see any value in this system. And it's the pattern for our systemic exclusion from many, many structures of institutions in our countries of origin. So, whether it's, access to land, access to health, access to employment, It's every indicator of development, we are out of it. And this also includes indigenous communities who are held outside of the system. They often use the term Adivasi to describe themselves. They also often will experience caste discrimination. Now, this could be its own lecture about the experiences of caste in our countries of origin, which is, one of the defining axes of exclusion. However, what we're here to talk about is actually caste in the United States. And I think this is a really important concept for anyone that understands racialization or Asian American communities overall, is that when we come to the United States, we might be racialized as South Asian, but the South Asian category itself is a category with a lot of inherent tensions that go back to our structures of inequality and historical traumas back at home. So, for example, we have tensions of, geography and borders. We have tensions that are related in religious intolerance and caste. And so I think as someone who grew up here as a Dalit, and actually had my parents, who lived in the closet for many years because of the fear of reprisal and consequence that they would face in being out, I always knew anecdotally, as did all of my other colleagues at Equality Labs, that caste discrimination existed. We had heard of people that had been fired from their jobs. We had heard of people that had experienced slurs and, open violence, but no one believed us. No one really listened to us because we were really unseen in terms of the academy and the people who understood, well, what makes us South Asian? And that's why, in one of our first projects, we actually conducted a survey of South Asian communities. And at that time, it was so controversial. I cannot tell you how hard it was to do this survey. There were very few people that were interested in this topic. And also, the South Asian community, because caste is such a taboo, did not want to discuss this. And, we had people who, when we would table in front of religious institutions or areas where, that were Indian markets or, Nepali markets, people would hurl slurs at us. They would also, try to take the papers of the survey if we were doing data collection. We also had people that would send us threats and emails for doing the survey. We even had an organization that went into existential crisis about even conducting the survey, and they had to, convene a meeting of their board. We had to give testimony as to what was happening. So it was such a different time, and it's crazy to think about it being 2016, but that shows how much has changed just by the virtue of Dalits being able to speak out, both in terms of data and in terms of our stories. So the results of those, that report that we did, and again, I shared the link earlier in my session, were pretty profound. We saw that 1 in 4 Dalits who responded said that they had faced some form of verbal or physical assault. 1 out of 3 had reported being discriminated against during their education, and 2 out of 3 reported being treated unfairly at their workplace. And just those 3 data points were enough to shock people. And I always got this question of clarification, and they'd be like, oh, you mean this is happening in our countries of origin, right? And I said, no, this is happening in the United States. And when you see the totality of this data, it's no wonder that, 1 out of 2 Dalits live in the closet and are afraid of being outed in terms of their identity. And that's very personal to me because my dad, he was in the closet up until his 74th birthday. And it's painful to watch members of your community not be able to be confident and be able to access the institutions that they have a civil rights mandate to be able to do. And yet, because of the prevalence of caste discrimination, people are living in fear for their jobs and for them to be able to continue their education. And universities are both places of work as well as educational institutions. So we know that as sites of violence, there is a need to address this discrimination with the highest duty of care as possible. Because, while it's totally lawful to extend the existing, categories where caste lives in right now, because currently, according to civil rights platforms, caste lives between the social category, the special categories of ancestry, race and faith. But I think one of the reasons why Dalits are asking for it to be made explicit is that, many institutions, who don't make it explicit are not training their teams in terms of caste competency, are not collecting data in terms of the amount of caste complaints, and are not really doing they're fulfilling their duty of care towards caste oppressed stakeholders. And as a result, many Dalit students and staff and faculty face a higher than normal level of caste stress and are not doing their best at these institutions. And the failure isn't on our community, it's actually on the institutions that are not, fulfilling their mandates related to Title IX and other civil rights obligations. And to get a sense of how long caste has existed in North America, I wanted to bring up this one picture, which shows Punjabi immigrants from Canada in the British Columbia area. And, these were some of the first immigrants from South Asia that were in North America. And what's really interesting, and this is a picture that takes place in the early 1900s. Punjabi Sikh immigrants were responsible for transforming the West Coast. They drained the swamps in terms of the Central Valley in California, in British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest. They actually worked the trees and worked in the lumber mills to be able to give us the lumber that went into the cities that we now know, like Vancouver and Seattle. And I think quite crucially, in those labor environments, between those first workers, there was casteism. And so we know from the family archives of Anita Lal, one of the oldest Dalit families in North America, her grandfather experienced caste discrimination, where in those mills, they saw that he was forced to not eat with the same, at the same tables, and he was forced to sit on the floor while the other people ate at the table. And then he was forced to sleep on the floor and not in the same bunks with the other workers. And, one of the owners of the mill saw that and said, we're not going to allow that. And that's how that was rectified. So caste discrimination in North America has been here for at least 100 years, if not longer. And, I think one of the things we always say, in Equality Labs is that wherever South Asians go, they bring caste. And so we need to just know that it exists and then begin to implement the policy remedies around it. I wanted to kind of just also bring up this one graphic because another instance where we see caste in history also came up from this period of history. And, because of, the white xenophobia that was coming out about immigrants that were coming at the turn of the century, there was a huge wave of anti-immigrant laws that were passed that really, forbid anybody that was not white from being an American citizen. And some of those first challenges to those racist immigration laws came from South Asians. And, two cases in particular, on the left is, A.K. Mozamdar, and on the right was Bhagat Singh Thind. These were two figures who basically challenged the racism by saying, we deserve the right to apply for citizenship because we are in essence brown white people because we are of upper caste. And I think that is such a challenging argument to have made because, while it is the first time caste is being discussed in American immigration law, it's done so in a way where we're seeing our members of our community pursue white adjacency at the expense of other communities. Because as they were arguing about being brown white people, they also, in the case of Bhagat Singh Thind, were also arguing that they supported segregation and they also supported miscegenation laws and would not allow, were not in favor of Black and white folks, being in interracial relationships. And that is a very challenging, history for us to confront as South Asians. And in fact, we have a moral duty to do so because, so much of a casteist mindset also leads to an anti-Black mindset. And so there's a lot that we can do to really make sure that we don't repeat these really painful, historical moments in our current pursuits of social justice. And, and I think it's a reminder, again, caste is always part of the conversations around South Asian history and our discourse of rights. And sometimes some of our community have not really stood on the right side of this issue. I also just wanted to bring up this really critical figure who is, Mogawalia, who was, one of the powerful leaders of the Gadar movement, which was an Indian independence movement that helped provide arms and supplies to the Indian independence movement in the 1920s and 30s. What's very interesting is that he was one of the first Dalit diasporic leaders to be involved in independence struggle. And he's a figure that isn't really remembered a lot, both in Asian American history or in South Asian history. But Dalit Americans really hold him dear because his historical contribution wasn't just that he was a courageous independence leader, but he also showed that there was casteism in that independence movement, because when he went back to India, he was so disgusted by the casteism of independence, of the independence movement, that he left behind the project of independence, went back to his state of Punjab, and started a political social movement to empower Dalit peoples called the Adhar movement. And that movement went then onwards to inspire, millions of Punjabis to, be comfortable with their caste oppressed identity. And it led the way to, the Rabadasiya faith, which is one of the strongest, caste oppressed faiths that operates all throughout the South Asian American diaspora. So again, another really critical figure and another really critical note related to Dalit American history in our communities. And then finally, I would be remiss if I didn't also lift up this other critical figure in terms of caste equity history and Dalit American figure, Dr. Ambedkar. And for folks that don't know his work, Dr. Ambedkar was the architect of the Indian Constitution. He also started the Reserve Bank of India. I mean, he is a towering founding figure in Indian and South Asian politics. And in fact, the Constitution, which he helped to craft, became the blueprint for many South Asian countries' constitutions. But one thing that I think is so critical for people to think about, especially when we're thinking about the role of immigration and the transnational relationships that we build, Dr. Ambedkar's time as a scholar also occurred at Columbia University, and he was one of the first Indians to attend an Ivy League school and be in higher education. And while he was there, he was really, he was very observant, because you have to keep in mind, he was at Columbia during the Harlem Renaissance. And what he saw when he was looking at the segregated and bigoted United States was, wow, here is another colony of the British. And while they were independent from the British, they still have pernicious ways that they treat those who are minorities, either by gender or by race. And so when he saw that women didn't have the right to vote, that Black folks were segregated and also disenfranchised from the right to vote, that really impressed upon him the deep need for there to be protections in the constitutional law of India, which was his country of origin, that he hoped to kind of bring his scholarship to bear. And ultimately, that's why he fought throughout his career for those changes in the Constitution and for later legal battles for the rights of women. So I think this is another example where our discourse in the South Asian American diaspora has ramifications, not just for our safety and equity here, but also join a larger legacy of transnational movement towards caste abolition. And then finally, I also wanted to talk about Dr. Ambedkar's exchange with W.E.B. Du Bois, because another critical component of Dalit liberation is that we have a Dalit internationalism, where we connect to other oppressed peoples as a way to circumvent, the ways that we've been deplatformed from the world by caste apartheid. And that Dalit internationalism is also deeply inspired, deeply embedded, and also deeply in material solidarity with Black internationalism. And there were so many figures who were engaged in building connections with, other oppressed peoples. But W.E.B. Du Bois is like one of those incredible, minds who was really thinking about Black liberation on so many fronts. And so there is this very kind of tantalizing exchange that existed between Dr. Ambedkar and W.E.B. Du Bois, where, you know, he speaks to W.E.B. Du Bois about inquiring about the way Black folks are doing international advocacy on the issue of segregation at the League of Nations and at the UN. And that was such a profound exchange. And, you know, W.E.B. Du Bois, you know, sends, you know, a response to him, wishing him well and, you know, saying a little bit about that. But I think it just really shows that oppressed communities see themselves in each other. And when the rule of law is racist or bigoted, we also find shared community as we work to make systems and institutions more lawful. And I think this is, again, another powerful legacy that we can draw from, especially as we open more and more conversations at this campus around caste equity. I want to go now to some of the cases now that we're dealing with around the issue of caste. And, you know, in terms of my own organizing history, I was politicized by one of the first cases of documented caste discrimination at the University of California in Berkeley. You know, and you know, Berkeley, which is a very, you know, small university town, you know, the second largest landlord in that city was this guy named Lucky Bali Reddy. And he, you know, owned at that time 50 million in property, had tons of building. Majority of students lived in his buildings. And this guy was a caste criminal. You know, over the course of his career, he basically trafficked, you know, 300 caste oppressed workers from his village. And 20 or so of them were actually young Dalit girls who were minors under the age of 18, who he exploited for sexual purposes as his sex slaves, as well as young girls who worked with him on his different buildings. And the thing that was so shocking about it was that it was out in the open. He never tried to hide it. These were, you know, children who were working in restaurants, serving people. They like cleaned up the roof and the gutters of his buildings. And it took other children. There were reporters from like the Berkeley High local newspaper. It took those children to see them as children to say something was wrong. And those reporters, you know, started to document and try to talk to those girls and ask questions like, why aren't they in school? They're like us. Shouldn't they be in high school? And then there was like a very chilling incident where one of his buildings caught fire, and one of those young girls, she was 13, died from smoke inhalation. And the other workers, you know, basically tried to smuggle her body out. So that nobody could see, you know, what was going on. And, you know, the tragedy, you know, was that once they were pulling her body out of this rug, they got to the street and their hand slipped and the rug fell out in the street and her body spilled out for everybody to see. And in that moment, there was a passer, you know, someone who was, you know, a bystander, and she was an elderly white woman. And she was like, what is this? And they tried to like hush her up and not do anything. And she said, don't do anything. I'm calling 911 right away. And thank God she did, because when she did that, it opened up an investigation into all of his nefarious procedures and all of the violent. I mean, this is such a violent family. But the courage of the girls that came forward and then were part of the prosecution can never be understated. And it's because of their courage, he got one of the first convictions related to, you know, trafficking on the basis of caste and sexual slavery, and he had to do time. And it was known that this was the first case to have caste discrimination in the United States. So this is a very powerful case, and I think it's also another terrain where everywhere you're seeing kind of, you know, unorganized, undocumented labor from the South Asian community, there's usually a nexus of caste and exploitation that's at work there, whether it's in the fields of domestic work, people who are working in restaurants, people who are working in construction. All of those communities have all of those employment areas have tons of undocumented caste oppressed workers. We also saw a case, in the South, where Signal Corporation trafficked caste oppressed workers to help rebuild Mississippi and, the Gulf after Hurricane Katrina. And these workers came through a coyote. They paid money to be exploited. They didn't realize they were doing that. They thought they were coming to the United States in good jobs. In fact, they were put into these like storage type containers, like crowded with like 10 or 12 to a room in 100 to 120 degree temperatures with their passports held, and, with like slave labor jobs. It was just such unconscionable conditions. And the government thought so too. And so after a very long, lengthy legal battle, they were rewarded like millions of dollars in one of the highest trafficking cases in labor history. Which kind of brings us to where we are today. In 2020, we have, again, another kind of groundbreaking case coming out of California, where the state of California sued Cisco Corporation. It's the first time an American corporation is being sued by a governmental agency for casteist hostile workplaces. And in this scenario, the complainant raised all of the key indicators of what makes up a hostile workplace. He was targeted because of his identity, faced critical complaints, as a way to intimidate him, in terms of his work product. He faced hostility, demotion, and eventually even termination. And thank God he knew he had a sense of his rights to be able to go to the DFEH, which was the Department for Fairness in Employment and Housing. And the thing that's so critical is that, the DFEH does not bring a case to litigation unless they have already investigated. And they did not need to be historical experts on caste to know that grave civil rights harms were occurring. So I think once they hit the sufficient bar for investigation, that's when they began the suit. And after this suit, thousands of Dalits across the country have come forward in institutions like the University of Wisconsin to basically talk about caste in their entities. And so it's so critical to know that you don't have to wait for harm to occur to be proactive, to make sure that, caste bias and discrimination is not tolerated at your institution. Because again, if you're waiting for harm, you're already creating liability for your institution. And no Cisco, which is why so many corporations are proactively adding caste as a protected category and really, working to build competency so that they can be a safe and welcoming institution for all. And finally, this last case, which I think is an important case, just opened up in New Jersey. And this was where there was a religious sect called the BAPS, sect, which, has, temples across the country, been accused by hundreds of workers now across like 6 different temples across the United States. And they trafficked Dalit workers to work for $1.20 an hour doing backbreaking work. The workers were called worms and, weren't given proper facilities. Their passports were seized, and there was tremendous amounts of abuse. And again, these workers, confidently came forward and said, we have rights. We are human. We have dignity. And now there is a full-fledged, federal investigation as well as a lawsuit for civil damages. And what's very interesting about that lawsuit is that the workers also, in their new amended complaint, have filed for RICO charges, which is the which is the kind of statute which you look at for the organized crime or the mob. But they're essentially saying that these dominant caste networks operated in similar criminal fashion to organized crime, which is a serious allegation. And so we'll be watching how this case develops. But again, it shows that caste isn't far away, caste isn't hypothetical. There are very severe legal cases that are operating in institutions around the country. And that's why we need to be very practical in the ways that we address this institution. And when we look at caste bias in labor, one of the common things we hear from people is that, the lack of competency. And I remember this one worker who said this, why would I report to HR when they probably don't even know where India is on the map? Now the onus of competency is not on, oppressed stakeholders, is really on those institutions. And so the things that people are seeing as a result of the lack of competency and the lack of policy are serious employment issues, whether it's the common usage of slurs, harassment, disparate salaries, unfair peer reviews, sexual harassment, retaliation. These are workplace problems, and we don't want your institutions to be, in a lack of compliance around these issues. We've also seen that with universities, students are experiencing a similar layer of harassment. And this is, a very poignant anecdote that, an indigenous, South Asian indigenous or Adivasi student talked about, where she was equivocated with animals, which was totally inappropriate and not right. And in that context, again, we see a similar pattern of casteism in universities, where there's discrimination in housing and dining, in addition to slurs and harassment. We also see casteist professors and syllabi, siloing and blacklisting of, Dalit students and faculty from professional networks, as well as retaliation and sexual harassment. So when we see those things, one of the things that we want to really make sure that we're able to address is by not taking the bull by the horns and adding competency and caste as a protected policy, we are seeing caste oppressed students have high levels of caste stress, which is analogous to racial stress. So the isolation and depression, also feeling like people aren't seen, having to represent one's community at the pressure of also facing what might happen when being outed. There's also many people that consider self-harm or dropping out. And even if they continue, difficulties with concentration and motivation. And again, in higher education, when we're talking about diversity and equity, we're not just talking about helping diverse students access an institution, they also need to be able to succeed at that institution. So again, if we do not really take the bull by the horns and add caste as a protected category and build those competencies, we are failing so many of our South Asian stakeholders, and we need to really be able to address it. And I think one of the most incredible things at this time is that, caste oppressed people are not waiting for our civil rights. We are doing everything we can to be able to be, to make sure that our civil rights are being implemented at every institution we're part of. This is an image from the congressional briefing that we did with Representative Pramila Jayapal's office. And we've been winning all across the country. And so most recently, we had all 23 campuses of the Cal State University system, one of the largest public university systems, add caste as a protected category. We've also had the California Democratic Party, Colby University, and UC Davis also add caste as a protected category. And all of this comes from that historical first step that Brandeis University takes. And I think this is where we're going to hear a lot of really amazing thoughts from Professor Rajesh about that journey, because, it's not far away, it's super lawful, and it's an incredible historical process to be able to join a movement where here's a really easy win for equity that, usually is much harder on other issues. And just to close, I just want to leave you guys with some of the things that universities can do. One, you can add caste as a protected category. Two, you can implement caste equity, diversity, and inclusion training for folks in HR and the EEOC office and staff to build caste competency. You can invest in Dalit organizations for consultancies and support work so that you diversify where university funding is going into. You can hold public talks and briefings on caste. You can collect data on caste exclusion, so you can help to set KPIs for measuring progress. And you can also conduct a review of past caste oppressed stakeholders so that you get a sense of what's possible. In either case, it's a really important conversation that we're having today. And, I just want to pass the reins over to Professor Rajesh because, again, he and his colleague, Professor Lawrence Simon, really were one of those first leaders that helped to kind of trailblaze what this could look like at a university institution. And so I'll pass it to Professor Rajesh to take it forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Thenmozhi. First of all, thank you for such an inspiring and compelling presentation. I learned so much in terms of the historical interlayers that go back to Indian immigration to the United States that totally predate what is this now national conversation across American society and in higher educational institutions. So thank you very much. Thank you for your work and your activism. And I too want to thank the hosts of this event, Tricia and Professor Mimi, and all the great folks that are involved in making this event possible. So I don't have a PowerPoint, and some people accuse me of speaking off the top of my head, stream of consciousness. There is some structure to what I'm going to present. I don't want to go for 40 minutes because I really want to engage in a conversation, have an interactive conversation, look at the chats and see how many people we can get involved. I guess if there are parts to this brief set of comments, I would like to first discuss Brandeis' history briefly. And then what I saw was the cultural conditions that long predate the establishment of the policy. The policies from a couple of years ago, more institutions are now doing it, as Thenmozhi was acknowledging. But what are the cultural conditions within a campus and in higher ed that could then lead to the possibility of the formalization of a policy? So that's equally as important as the actual work of engaging in the policy. And then, of course, in the third part, what actually happened? What did we do? How did it become a reality? Because many institutions are aspiring. And quite frankly, many institutions are hitting roadblocks that prevent it from becoming a reality. So that's what I'll do. Brandeis, if you know something about the history of this particular institution, by the way, I was raised in California. I'm the son of immigrants who came here when I was 3 months old. So I will interweave my own caste consciousness into this discussion. But having been a lifelong Californian, I had this image of Brandeis that then sort of resonated by the time I got there, which was about 10 years ago. I realized, okay, here's an institution that was actually, if you go back to 1948, was founded on combating exclusion. There were quotas against Jews in America in the first few decades of the 20th century. And to found an institution to say, look, we're going to be open and non-sectarian and ecumenical and inclusive, secular in its roots, but we want to be open to everyone. There's something to be said for that, the root or the foundation. But what a lot of people may not know is that, yeah, it was home at last for Jewish students in the early 20th century. As we're talking about casteism now, caste hierarchy, caste prejudice, think about that, and think about the enduring issues that a lot of Jewish Americans have to face in the 21st century with regard to anti-Semitism. But an underlying narrative is what I also like to celebrate is the incredible voice and work of Black scholars and students, really from the beginnings. If you've ever heard of Pauli Murray, the great civil rights activist and lawyer, the first woman to get a doctorate of juriscience at Yale, but the work she'd done, and also a member of the Brandeis community at one point, sort of showed that when you think about intersectionality, you think of not only a minority group, but when we get into discussions of caste and we think about intersectionality, and I'll be drawing a lot of analogies to race, even though as Thenmozhi said, they're not exactly the same, but how do we create solidarities so we can promote civil rights, formalize those rights? But to be a minority within a minority, when the dominant society sees a minority, it's visual, it's visible. What you don't see, what's invisible, is if you're a minority within the minority. You're an oppressed within the oppressed. You're a colonized within the colonized. And that's what the struggle really is about, is to engage in what is that intersectionality. As you move forward, if you've heard of the great thinker Herbert Marcuse, one of the most recognized intellectuals of his time in America, contemporaneous with all the great student movements in the 60s and the civil rights movements. He was at Brandeis, and his famous student, who in her own right would be a path blazing thinker and individual that we all acknowledge now 30 years into her work, is Angela Davis. She was at Brandeis too. And lastly, I'll acknowledge Patricia Hill Collins, the sociologist who actually started the idea of intersectionality within the social sciences, coming out of sociology, contemporaneous with Kimberly Crenshaw and others who were the first generation that founded critical race theory. So when I think of Brandeis, I think of a place that has a long history that is committed to social justice. Fast forward to 2015 when this work began, because the policy didn't come about till 2019. 2020 through COVID now, 2021, 22, we can see the flickerings of other campuses, taking this on. But what was happening in 2015 in higher ed, for those of us that were in higher ed, and those of you that were students, maybe as undergrads, now you're graduate students, you can recall this. Think about the struggle of Black Lives Matter. Really now over 12 years old, but take 2010, it was right after President Obama was elected the first term, certainly what skyrocketed from 2012 onwards, a series of police shootings and homicides of unarmed, innocent Black people, men and women. apply to trans folks of color, if we want to get into that level of intersectionality and that narrative. But Black Lives Matter and the whole take on anti-Black racism on campuses, sort of yet a new sort of generation and a new set of thinking, how many decades after the Civil Rights Movement? And after the Civil Rights Movement, the deterioration of Black rights and equity in America in the 70s, 80s, and onwards, to see a new generation arise and say, okay, well, what are the issues that we face in higher ed? It was in 2015 that a lot of campuses were, the administrations were occupied by students trying to fight for greater representation on the faculty, greater sensitivity to the needs of first-generation students, greater diversification in intercultural communication, competency when it comes to mental health and counseling. Thenmozhi mentioned caste, stress, but we talk about racial stress. So that was the setting, and it was really a historic moment where my colleague, Professor Lawrence Simon, who was the founder of the Sustainable International Development Program at Brandeis, and who is not of South Asian background. He's a multi-generational of the Jewish background, multi-generational American who partnered with one of the leading Dalit scholars of his generation in India, Dr. Suharto Thorat, former chairman of the Grants Commission, professor emeritus at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Sort of an epic and historic moment for them to meet and discuss sort of comparative relations between various forms of exclusion around the world and this question of caste, particularly from the perspective of Dalit liberation. Because as Thenmozhi said, you might think of $250 million in India, maybe more, because it's a question of documentation, people being afraid, people passing, people converting out of Hinduism. But the stigma and the trauma of caste continues in these other religions, let's say the Abrahamic faiths and Buddhism, that promise equality, but in fact, the stigma of caste continue on. So, and then to think about tribals and indigenous peoples, 70 to 80 million. This comparison, and which we can go back to Thenmozhi's presentation, that early 20th century dialogue, that the founding figure of the 20th century, towering figure in two respects, W.E.B. Du Bois for Black sociology and Black liberation in the 20th century, and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar on the Indian context as a Dalit, and as the chairperson that drafted the first draft of the Indian Constitution after independence. And fast forward to Martin Luther King and his visit in the 60s with the Dalit leaders, when the term was untouchable. And Martin Luther King is talking about the Black struggle here, and there was this moment of solidarity. I can't place Dr. Suharto Thorat and Dr. Professor Lawrence Simon in the same breath of Dr. Martin Luther King and Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois and Dr. Ambedkar. But in a way, similarly, at least with regard to our contemporary American context, to have this dialogue become visible. So we initiated a series of conferences. We invited organically Dalit leaders, academics, scholars, students struggling in the Indian context, struggling here. How can we have our place, our moment, where we can come together and produce a series of scholarly works on this issue? This is all to say that in this climate in the mid-2010s, when people are thinking about anti-oppression in general, there's a moment to now introduce this question of caste oppression within the American context. So to fast forward to the initial conditions that led to the development of the policy, once again, Professor Simon, myself, another faculty member, several students found an opportunistic moment to have a dialogue with our chief diversity officer, who was not of the South Asian background, who quite frankly was new to the idea of caste, at least in terms of its formal definitions, what we just heard from both Professor Minnie and from Thenmozhi, and the great work she's doing with the quality labs, that to try to see that if this is a question of what we can visualize or count, is this a question of a critical mass? Or is it a question of social justice and equity? And if you find one incident of discrimination, let alone a systemic prevalence of some pattern of exclusion, then of all places, higher ed needs to be a space where let's at least have the conversation. Let's learn. So there's like this little opening that began. But as anything, what drives an initiative, this is the power of you, the students. And if I have to footnote this discussion, this is at this point, I speak on my own behalf as an individual faculty member who happen to participate in these events, but I don't represent my institution, and I don't represent the current views or what the impact of the consequence of this policy is. So I'm going to only speak from my perspective of what I saw, and I'm hoping that will help you because I want to speak openly and transparently. Students driving forward this discussion, trying to amass cases and incidents. And I speak on two levels here, because when I think about anti-casteism, and I think about what we can say is a kind of caste critical theory, just like you have a critical race theory. Let's keep in mind a very crucial distinction. Yes, we need to focus on individual acts of discrimination and marginalization, and the manifestations in Thenmozhi's presentation. So, what are these manifestations of this type of alienation? Concretely, is it in the workplace? Is it, with regard to the sharing of social space? To miniaturize or microscopically see an active Jim Crow segregation. That's the structure in a social space. The two different groups can't share the same social space. Obviously, there's no equality within separation. That was the overturning of Plessy with Brown v. Board. But think about that level of the miniaturization, the microscopic level at the dinner table, not being able to sit at the same dinner table, or being outed, and therefore leading to, once a person's caste identity comes out, first of all, there's a great fear when that occurs, because that could lead to all kinds of other marginalizations and stigmatizations. So to get those anecdotes, get those stories out, try to understand, okay, what are we talking about here? That was probably the single most important force in at least bringing to the formal level of conversations some kind of some discussion around this. And as we've all said, and I'm happy to actually, if someone wants to make me a co-host, I can maybe take us to the screen eventually, and we can look at the policy ourselves. I mean, it looks like a few paragraphs, but it's fairly straightforward. Although we're seeing, as Thenmozhi said, cases, there's a history of the jurisprudence, there are current cases underway in which not only is there oppression in general of some kind of grave injustice, the most extreme that you heard of the Berkeley case, but within that, it's the exploitation of Dalit peoples and workers. But that's the discussion at the level of the law. Law focuses on individual acts of discrimination. Those of us that are engaged in social justice movements and activism want to imagine a whole new structure, a whole new social structure. We're thinking about this at the systemic level. Critical race theory was to say in the 80s and 90s, look, if you're going to focus on individual acts of discrimination, that's one thing. But how about moving from that notion of it being individualistic or an aberrational act where there's a cause and effect relationship, and you can prove something like a hate crime? Why don't we raise the stakes and talk about this at the systemic level? Similarly, with all of his genius and his vision to draft the Constitution to ban discrimination on the basis of caste, ban untouchability, the problem is that it persists systemically, so prevalently, and now in the diaspora, not now, but historically, as Thenmozhi said, when the first Indian immigrants came, but certainly today, for it to persist, the analogy I draw is when the US Constitution in the 15th Amendment says we are not going to tolerate discrimination on the basis of race. It becomes a protected category of class. The US Constitution says nothing about banning racism. The Indian Constitution says no discrimination on the basis of caste. It says nothing about the eradication, annihilation, to quote Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, of casteism. So that's what I think is, we have to get into that level of social critique to understand this is not about identifying just one or two individuals of discrimination. And if you do want to magnify it, if you want to talk about numbers, that startling 2 billion, 1.9 billion. I was engaged in a series of conversations with activist leaders, heads of NGOs, folks at Amnesty, former heads of the director within the UN OCHR, the UN in terms of human rights. But if you peel back this notion, take that definition of caste, and I loved what you had, Thenmozhi, caste apartheid, ascription of some identity at birth that determines the life outcome, as Professor Minnie said. Segregation in terms of space, work, marriage, temple worship, et cetera, the life prospects, the horrendous segregation that takes place starting with your birth. There's only one way out, death. But couple that with where this was born. It wasn't born on the moon, didn't come from another religion, it came from one religion. And this gets us into a very thorny set of issues, because for those that say we're attacking something like Hinduism, Think about the expression, the free expression among academics, that when you want to be critical of something, you're not intending to create hate about another person. You're using the freedom as academics to inquire into social systems of inequality. It's, in other words, a very, very, very fine line between claiming that someone is attacking somebody's religion and saying that when a religion is manifest in a society, and society perpetuates a system of inequality, that we should have the freedom to engage in that. That is not the same thing as attacking somebody's religion, which could be a separate matter when it comes to academic free expression. But to think about this level of caste, what makes it so difficult? Because you might think racial discrimination, because something is visualized, even though it's a social construction that can change over time, the social construction of whiteness. One of the founding figures of critical race theory, Cheryl Harris, Whiteness is Property in 1993, along with the other more famous critical race theorist, Kimberly Crenshaw, whiteness is property. It's a protected property asset. Not just the ability to objectify everything else that's non-white and build a census around that, but to protect this conception and ingrain that in our laws and institutions and how property is consolidated. Think about how powerful an idea that is. Something that we're trying to dismantle, right? These movements of diversity. But similarly, when you think about this consolidation of power and capital at that level, that if you want to try to visualize something in caste, well, let's just take a look at the metaphysics of it. The transmigration of the soul from one body to another. So one slice in time, one living generation, those that are yet to be born, we don't know who they are. And those that have left us in the past, they're not with us. This slice in time in the present, in a present generation, to isolate a soul and designate that as impure and maintain the purity of a few, which is a very tiny percentage of the triangle that Thenmozhi introduced. And for that conception to justify the punishment and degradation and dehumanization of many bodies and make this intergenerational, that means you don't escape this type of work that is ascribed to you. Not only do you not escape it in the course of your lifetime, this continues in an intergenerational way. That's how caste perpetuates. So if you think about that paradox, punishing a body based on a conception of a definition that some souls are pure and some are impure, and for this to be a living horror or nightmare for millions of people, that's the crux of the issue. How do we take that on? How do we take on that notion, that level of oppression, when in fact it does involve something that is religious and metaphysical? Again, I need to bifurcate this because a lot of people get upset. Are you attacking the religion? Well, Marx attacked religions. And there are self-critiques of Christianity, starting with great thinkers in Europe, from Nietzsche onwards, so many philosophers. Self-criticism within a religion is one thing. The criticism or atheistic sort of debates about the pernicious nature of religion and the disenfranchisement of those that want to be free from religious oppression. So, the positivity of the rights around atheism, those are separate debates. So this is not a discussion about an attack or a critique of him. This is a question of, why is it so difficult for people to see what caste discrimination is? Well, it means you need to understand. That's what they're saying. What is it? How does it actually manifest the discrimination? What are the repercussions? And what does that mean if we are committed as democracies to constitutional foundations of equality? So, this is a way of, I think, bringing it back to the focus of the policy. In terms of the steps, and sorry if this is sort of a natural transition or segue, because I think I was asked to think about the practical nature of what I recall. When the students came together, we created those cultural conditions on our campus, those conferences I mentioned. One of our happier moments was to acquire a bust of Dr. B. Ambedkar and get the approval to have the bust in the library with other great social justice figures of the 20th century. But it's about that awareness. I think it is about teaching subaltern, alternative, decolonized forms of history. Gandhi is a huge epiphenomenal figure that becomes the face of 20th century nonviolence and liberation. But if you do the history, if you study it, you say, well, wait a minute, Gandhi is a contemporary with Ambedkar. They have many epic, historic debates, tensions, stresses between them regarding the liberation of Dalit peoples. In other words, the reason I bring this up, if you want to take a view of global South, post-colonial histories, of decolonizing and liberating from the Western empires and the racist, Eurocentric racist roots of those Western empires, massive, massive project. The lingering effects of colonization throughout the global South and the East. But if you do that project without an intersectional lens, you're not going to see, as I said, the colonized within the colonized. That's what we're talking about. We can talk about racial oppression after the civil rights period in a system that is not only rooted in white supremacy here in the United States, but is being perpetuated as whites are being minoritized as the society is rapidly diversifying. This society by 2050 is going to be majority non-white across the board. And with the younger generations now being older, who are already majority non-white, think about that question. That's why I think the term apartheid is very appropriate. Those in the dominant power are minoritized and yet retain the power as everything diversifies. That's our American context. But because of the hierarchy that Thenmozhi showed us, the minority was always in power, spiritual power and physical power over a mass of individuals. So it's not exactly the same dynamic, but it just goes to show that if you think about this from a democratic perspective, equal and free in dignity, all individuals at birth and at death, but to have a very small percentage govern the lifetime, determine the life outcomes of a whole mass of people. And by mass, if people want to talk about critical mass, I'll put this before you. You are in a higher educational institution right now, University of Wisconsin. I'm in my institution, I don't know, 1,500 across the country. You know, how many are research institutions? There's so many with PhD and MA programs. But in the last few decades, at least the last, let's say, 10, 15, 20, I'll just speak about that, try to delimit this a bit so I don't spew out wrong statistics. Or I can just speak for my own institution. You know, if we think about 20% of the undergraduate population being international, and think about graduate programs, MA and PhD, across all fields, sciences, social sciences, humanities, creative arts, you think of professional schools, business schools, law schools, med schools, you know, think about now 30% potentially international students being such a force who have their own concerns with racism and xenophobia and assimilation issues and you know, immigration status, their own marginalization, and we have to attend to that. But again, I want you to think about this in terms of intersectionality. When the dominant groups from contexts come to Western institutions, which is what we're talking about in this case, and maybe present one view of the worlds that they come from, but there are minorities within those groups who also join in the migration and are treated disparately, then you tell me, how's that acceptable? How can, in the quest for acceptance and inclusion and diversity, if that's what we want to celebrate, the global diversity, the international diversity, the tremendous contributions that the rest of the world can bring to this country while it's trying to deal with its own issues, well, then how can within that space, how can such a level of exclusion and discrimination take place? I think I'm at 2:10 now. I'll come up with a few concluding reflections. I want to be mindful, Professor Minnie, when exactly are we going to pause before we go to the Q&A and the discussion? You can just let me know and I'll round up my thoughts.
Yeah, we have time. So if you want to just wrap up the discussion, we have a few questions as well from audience. And
Sure.
I also have a few questions that I thought will be interesting for our audience to know more about.
Great, great.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that in my concluding remarks, I'd have to, I tend to speak of the intersectional relationship and multiplication of the relationships between the isms. Not at the individual level of discrimination. That's where the work of the law and the work of civil rights has to go forward. Because in fact, there are these discriminatory cases and they are egregious and there is justice. As a scholar, as a researcher, I want to think about the systemic level. I want to think about the theory of change and the actualization of it. So I think of isms. I think of racism at the systemic level. And I invite us all to think about how we might all understand what that is, what we mean by that. What is that Du Boisian sense that only BIPOC really had, that second insight? Once we're made to feel different at some point growing up in a white majority society, like my generation did in the United States. And the veil goes up. You see the world through the eyes of the other. I'm brown, I'm not white. I'm made to be this other. Do I lift up the veil and go back to my innocence? Like when I was a baby and I can't remember what I looked like, didn't have a mirror image. Now that's impossible. Can I undo the trauma, that first stinging sense of being othered? No, it's in me. In our case, is Black and brown, people of color in this country, especially if you're older like me, Generation X. You have those first memories of that stigmatization, being called the N-word, getting a beat down by a group of kids, being racialized. I don't want to mansplain as a cis, het, straight, identified person, but as a person of color, I'm a cis, het, man of color. I think of systemic sexism and the sex hierarchy and the patriarchy that reproduces itself in terms of inequality in so many different ways, not just in our laws and policies, but in terms of our everyday life, in terms of our politics, in terms of the acceptance of misogyny from the last candidate, or the last president, who won on the basis of this vocalization of misogyny and sexism. How can that be? Why would there be a Me Too movement now over the last few years as opposed to what should have been 20, 30 years ago? Think about that. This is the United States. The resurgence of queer rights, the visibilization of that, the legalization of gay marriage, the debates about trans rights now, the right to bodily self-determination, not a description of gender at birth, binaryism, heterosexism. Wow, what is that? I don't know. Sexism, racism. Yeah, let's talk about that. What is that? Okay, well, some of us are part of the majority, but are there not benefits that accrue to that force people to closet or out or run the risk of being outed? What is that passing? What is that self-annihilation that takes place on a daily basis? Our space is not set up for that. It's inclusion. So let's think about that. Ableism. We talk about neurodiversity. We talk about undiagnosed disability. We talk about racial equity and access questions. We talk about the long, complex history of disabilization and racism for groups. Ableism. White supremacy, male supremacy, binary supremacy, hetero supremacy, ableist supremacy, nativism. The plight of Native Americans is one thing, but those that say that I'm a natural born American citizen and I have one conception or definition of what that is. Well, no, that doesn't work. Not only when there are going to be increasing rates of immigration. And then finally, nationalism. I put that in there because if we truly have the freedom to question our democracies, whether it's here or in India, we should have the right to question, therefore, the nationalisms, the nationalist picture, the national unitary identity of what it means to be that Indian or American. So all the isms, well, we have to add caste. Casteism. Let's think about that together. When I think of caste, I think of a combination of and perpetuation, not in the same manner as Black slavery, please don't get me wrong, when we think about today's modern forms of intergenerational slavery. And I think of Jim Crow segregation, stratification of social space, prevention of relationships, the right to be seen as one citizen, not two, but separate, but somehow speciously equal. So when I think about that, and I think about, again, this highly problematic question, which is how come some people are deemed to be different, that then warrants the justification of the punishment of their bodies. I think about the criminal justice reform here in the US context, the history and the current manifestation of white supremacy and the treatment of Black and brown bodies, but then I think about the treatment of adult bodies. And finally, I can't in my conscience have a conversation, a discussion about this if I don't come back to what I started out with, this notion of intersectionality. The more complex you get into intersectionality, who are the most vulnerable within the most vulnerable when it comes to the basic right to live. Living with dignity is what a lot of us minorities aspire to, but let's just talk about the basic right to live. I wonder and I feel for women of color and women, Dalit individuals, and queer folks of color. I can't imagine a level of complexity of marginalization and oppression unless we can not speak for and not appropriate, but listen and understand. More spaces to open up. Okay, so I think normally this would lead to a 3-hour graduate seminar over the course of a semester, but I will pause here. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's been a wonderful discussion. And I think, there are interesting points that both the speakers have addressed. And in the interest of time, I thought maybe we could just think about the relevance of this particular panel in the context of the conversations YSUG is organizing in terms of making caste a protected category at UW-Madison. So there are some questions, questions as well as misconceptions that emerges when you talk about caste as a protected category. So just to begin our discussion, I was just wondering, if at all, do you need students from caste oppressed background to testify in order for the university to take an action? Or in other words, do you need a data set? Do you need a survey? Do you need any kind of institutional mechanism to see how many people will be impacted by caste oppression in the campus before the administration can take a call on it? What has been the procedure so far? If you could enlighten us a little bit more about it from your experience at Brandeis. And for Thenmozhi, I know that Equality Lab has been in the forefront for supporting other campuses, including Cal State and Colorado. So in your experience working with student organizers as well as faculty who were spearheading the movement, what is the advice that you have for us, especially when there is a strong momentum built in the campus and the whole organizing of YSUG is centered around the need to make dignity the very core part of a social existence? So over to you both.
I would just say that's a very interesting question because it doesn't really reflect how civil rights responsibilities actually need to be held at Title IX institutions. You never have to wait for harm to happen to act to stop harm, just at a basic level. And also, I want to also be really open, we work actually with many Title IX, EEOC, and diversity equity centers across the United States, both at corporations and at universities. And every single person that we're talking to who's trained in DEI does not data set or the need for documented cases to act to prevent harm, because there's already enormous amount of both anecdotal and also our data set that shows that significant harm is occurring related to caste. And I think that, again, we have 30 campuses across the country, as well as, more that are actively working on this issue. And I think the thing that comes up is that, the issue of whether or not there's complaints is really irrelevant. But that said, where there are complaints, they're very heartbreaking, and one of the things that I've heard over and over again from Dalit stakeholders is that we were concerned about coming forward to report, one, being if the Title IX and EEOC had the competency, and two, the consequences of us being publicly out to make such a report could be damning in terms of our current existence as well as what comes afterwards. And to give you a sense of like what Dalit faculty and student are facing, we have had reports of people receiving physical threats, getting digital harassment and doxing. There are also attempts to interfere with their grading process by reporting them to their professors for doing this work. We had a Dalit student that faced a professional investigation at their workplace that they had for their campus job because they were reported for being racist and religiously bigoted for working on the issue of caste equity, and she had to endure a 2-month work investigation. Again, being conducted by an HR person that didn't necessarily have caste competency, but again, who saw the tremendous amount of harassment that this person was facing. And I think with some of the stuff that you shared, Darshana, at the beginning of this talk, the other additional fear of reprisal that Dalit students and faculty are facing is that, increasingly we have seen dominant caste bigots call immigration on students, saying that people are in violation of their visas. They're concerned about getting, if they're getting government scholarships from their countries of origin in South Asia, they're worried about them losing funding, and also threats to their family, because again, caste is a system of exclusion. Our students are facing systemic structural exclusion, and they are worried, again, not just about these immediate harms, but also, I remember very poignantly, talking to someone who was an alumni of another Midwest major university, and he had this exchange with a dominant caste Brahmin student who basically said, "I'm so glad to be here in the United States, away from the the caste scum that are the lower castes. They've destroyed our universities, and people without merit don't get to go to school. But here, I'm in a country that's a meritocracy. I can succeed without them clinging to the teat of society." I mean, first of all, who talks like that? But that level of violent microaggression is very common. And luckily, our wonderful colleague called him out on it, and he said, "By every single measure, I am your equal. Every single measure, I'm your equal, and I'm actually doing better than you academically. Just shut your mouth." And then he walked, and then that other person walked away because he'd never seen someone who's a caste oppressed put a boundary around his microaggression and slurs. And after he left, 2 other students came up to him and said, "We're like you. We're like you, but we can't afford to come out because he's from our community," meaning like the language community. Because keep in mind, with South Asia, we have 300 dialects, so they're from the same state in South Asia. And he said, they said, "We're from that person's community and we're in tech. If we come out, we will lose the housing that we have because people will know that we're Dalit, and it'll affect us in our careers as we go onward." And we've seen that documented. The part of this is that casteist, academic institutions breed casteist alumni networks that then create, professional networks that create casteism in, different corporations. So breaking the cycle of violence starts at the university. We know that because even companies like Google, when they're looking at the terrible, abysmal, rates of Black employees leaving their company, some of their diversity equity, vision isn't that, oh, we have to just do work better in terms of our institution. They're talking about how do we go from cradle to career to commit to equity? What are the interventions that need to happen to address the systemic exclusion BIPOC students and later, professionals face? And I think we have to be similarly intentional and thoughtful about the issue of caste equity, to ask for data and to demand that students come forward in violent situations is actually itself violating, the norms related to civil rights disclosures. And it also shows that there needs to be greater levels of caste competency build, because every single person that knows caste oppressed people, again, in our data set, 1 out of 2 Dalit people are afraid of coming out because of the fear of reprisal. So you cannot force people to come out to address this harm. It must be addressed at the highest level. Otherwise, because it's lawful to add caste as a protected category, it is unlawful to allow for discrimination at your institution. So that should not be the barrier for us to be able to move forward to thinking about how we build caste equity. And again, no other university institution is talking about this in this way. They are moving forward because, again, beyond doing the right thing to do, nobody wants to be the next Cisco. Nobody wants that liability. And it's a liability when civil rights aren't being implemented.
Thank you, Thenmozhi.
I think that's a great response, Marie. Darshana, did you want me to follow up with that about your question?
Yeah,
And
that would
also,
be awesome.
and
Thank you.
then interweave that with a couple of questions here that are opened up in the chat. If we all look at that from Mahima and Miriam, what can students do to bring about awareness of caste? And then Miriam's great question too. We can just read out that aloud. I think it's relevant to what you just said, Thenmozhi, and what I want to say as well. Thanks so much for this great talk and all your research and activism. Question for both presenters. I was curious whether in your research and activism there were instances of caste-based discrimination coming not only from toward people of South Asian descent, but also from toward other racialized communities. Also a question for Thenmozhi, which we can come back to, Thenmozhi. At some point in your presentation, you mentioned that caste is viewed to reside at the intersection of ancestry, race, and faith. So I'm wondering if you can unpack the race part a bit more. What definition of race underlies this understanding? I was just going to put something in the chat box for all to look at. This, indulge me, I'm not trying to promote my work here, but it's sort of a global network of individuals. When I think of, is it a critical mass of getting 1 or 2 stories out, anonymized, of course, to make the case, and then face this pushback? The instinct is like, well, how big of a problem is this? As Thenmozhi said, there are issues of fear and stigma of coming forward. Even the structure of Title IX, you can't compel someone to come forward, but you have to give them a space to actually articulate it without retaliation and blowback. And there are ombudspeople, for example, on campuses to have those confidential, non-shared conversations, but how do you actualize the justice? You can't compel people to come forward. So it is incumbent, as Thenmozhi is saying, for the institutions to take a lead, not just in corporations as protection from liability, but I would imagine in higher ed, it's about the spaces of maximal inclusion. The way I come at it, though, is that if, let's say, you can't find as many, but the question is really, let's get a greater understanding of the caste phenomenon. If in fact, there are some type of resemblances with other groups around the world, which share common kinds of experiences when it comes to the nature of the marginalization. Think about the Roma in Europe. There's a continuation of a feudalistic practice from Japan, the Bukharim. There's a Kolomboro from the Atlantic slave trade in Brazil. There's intergenerational slavery in Africa, in various parts of Africa, when we think about, and the treatment and the alienation of certain groups who are ascribed something by birth, the treatment of albinism, or this sort of like segregation of folks when it comes to, quote unquote, the demonic or the impure when it comes to witchcraft. So there are conversations we can have globally that are comparative in nature without trying to speak for the other group. When we come together and we try to talk about the various mechanisms that do 2 things. They're discriminated from birth, they're assigned this identity, it forces you, for the most part, into certain types of occupation, but it certainly determines your life outcome. So that's kind of like how the conversation begins, and you can see that you can kind of create this cross-pollination. You don't want to dilute the issue, though. Talking across all these different types of groups and phenomenon, you got to have some basic understanding of what the nature of the discrimination is. How do you raise the awareness about its unacceptability? I mean, there can't be anything more heinous than actually alienating some students from eating at the same table and sharing the same meal with others. Think about that, something that's fundamental, that everybody has to eat, do something during the course of the day. You start there. So yeah, you accrue the stories. But call it, I put it back to Thenmozhi now to how do we address this? Because I get this question too, is, well, if I open up Pandora's box, I got to worry about every single group on the planet that can make some claim towards alienation and marginalization. That's true, but at least here's one group of people speaking out, trying to fight for the same life chances that are being deprived in other contexts. They come in with the presumption that they can at least have the clean slate, and yet there's this persistence of discrimination. So let's at least have a conversation about that. So Thenmozhi, I'll put it back to you while I look at the chat here.
Sure. And also, I think, maybe just picking up on that and then also answering Mariam's question. I think, again, there is a great kind of moral call to action to add caste as a protected category, but also there is a great legal foundation within which to do so. So if you think about the United States, we actually have two very strong legal foundations for caste to think about. And actually the United States is very, very in a unique position to do so, because in American racial law history, we, during the time of Jim Crow and other kind of vile segregationist laws that were the rule of law in the United States, many abolitionists were looking for legal justifications in order to think about how we might be able to talk about a terrain for civil rights. Many of those first legal scholars actually at that moment drew upon the language that was put into place related to caste. So much of our first civil rights litigation, and this is work that is done by another amazing Midwest civil rights scholar, Professor Kevin Brown, who we can definitely put your folks in touch with. He has written pretty extensively about this, that, from civil rights all the way up to Plessy versus Ferguson, the use of caste was actually the language that we use to talk about racial abolition. So we already have a foundation for within which to discuss the usage of caste, and caste has been named in these different ways for that reason. So it's not new to the legal system, it's there and it's present. And I think, Miriam, that actually goes to why I was speaking about, where does caste exist? Because again, I want to be very clear, what Dalit stakeholders are asking is not the addition of a category that's not covered under current law. Currently, caste is found, by different institutions to be either under, the categories of discrimination based on ancestry, on race, or by faith. It could be either one of these sections. And I think the thing to know within that is that, while that has kind of sat, in these different places, the need for it to be explicit is because when it's explicit, we can ensure that competency is being built, data is being collected, and that, it's assigned to the campus that people know that caste oppressed students can avail themselves of all of the civil rights protections that are there. And when it's not present, more often than not, Dalit stakeholders are finding there's a lack of competency and therefore a liability with relationship to their experiences in terms of the civil rights obligations of those institutions. And I think that, Professor Rajesh mentioned this, but, at the international level, like the United States is a signatory at the intergovernmental level, at the UN and other institutions, to many covenants related to anti-discrimination and racism. Within that, that's where it is, that's where the precedent has been set. And again, Professor Smita Narula from Pace University was one of the experts and the people that led that charge. Again, caste there is seen as discrimination based on work and descent. And the category of caste within that applies to not just, folks that come out of caste apartheid in South Asia, but actually all communities around the world that, come from hierarchical systems based on birth and the type of work that those communities, whether it's in Japan or in Nigeria or Latin America. And so I think in thinking about this policy very practically for your institution, the category of caste is its own thing, and making it explicit would allow anyone from those communities to use it in workplace investigation. So it doesn't impede on any other category, whether that of religion or of ancestry. It is its own thing that would then allow for someone who's caste oppressed to say, I've experienced harm. And then whoever's conducting the investigation would then use that to be able to look at the mindset of the harm doer at that time. And I think that when we've seen campuses apply this, and I'm thinking like of the Harvard Graduate Student Union, there was a lot of thoughtful intention when they negotiated caste as part of their collective bargaining agreement, not just to add caste, but to think about investigations and how can someone raise a complaint? What are the safety issues? What is the training of the investigators that are required? And what are the ways to remedy harm? Because harm can be remedied in so many different ways, but also to look at, are there ways that conflict mediation and other ways to have productive conflict and learning could be incorporated as part of a larger, abolitionist process. So there's a lot of experimentation happening right now. And I think quite critically, a new sector that has really actively taken this on has been organized labor. And this is very new, both for workers' history as well as for Dalit history and racial justice history. But major unions are lining up around the flanking Dalit workers and taking very, powerful stances for caste equity. In fact, the Asian Pacific arm of the AFL-CIO passed a caste resolution. They added caste as a protected category, and they're asking all of the workplaces that their workers work in also add caste as a protected category. They also are joining many faculty unions across the United States, the largest, of which was recently at Cal State, where the California Faculty Association, which supports over, 25,000 faculty and staff, to add caste to their collective bargaining agreement. So again, I think what we're seeing here is a sea change, a movement for civil rights, where caste is being seen as, caste equity is part of worker rights, caste equity is part of queer rights, caste equity is part of women's rights. And again, there is a moral call to action around us having campuses that reflect our values. And in addition to that, even if that's not the case, nobody wants to create, conditions for liability for the institution. So you don't need to wait for complaints to be ahead of the curve around addressing this. And the more that you get your institution aligned, the more that you can just be assured that, access for Dalit students is a success for everyone on campus. And that's what we want, is a campus that's accessible to all.
Thank you, Thenmozhi. I have a question about the caste competency, which Alicia has already asked. If you could just, talk a little bit about Equality Lab, and if at all, HR of institutions would want to reach out to you, what are the provisions available, and what does this training entail? If you can talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
I mean, DEI work is very humbling and very, it's very compassionate and empathetic work, and we do this work with institutions all around the world. We're one of the only institutions that specialize in caste equity and DEI work at that measure. But, usually it starts with like an intake at an institution to kind of understand what is the scope of what exists in terms of caste harm at the institution. And then based on that, we co-design a process with an institution to, start with kind of the folks responsible for supervision and cultures of belonging and equity to help build their competency. And then once their competency has been built, they then start to brainstorm ways that they can start to have public-facing workshops and training, because training is one of the first big, first steps to kind of really stopping caste hostility in workplaces and educational institutions. But I also think an interesting approach that we do is we really look at how we can discuss caste and race through the lens of mindfulness. And the reason why I bring that up is that, if this was just an intellectual endeavor, we could probably be one and done, because it's like there are so many books about the issue of caste, just like there is with race. But actually what gets in the way of that conversation is our nervous systems, the fragility of people that have benefited from privilege, the fear of the people that are being oppressed. These create divides that make it hard to have courageous conversations. So when we're able to be centered and calm in our nervous system, to have self-awareness and self-reflection, not just of our lineages, but how that informs how we show up to have these conversations, it allows people new tools to be able to hold space for each other as you work to build a culture of equity. And we've seen that model be incredibly successful We've worked with organizations that are very large as well as organizations that are very small. But I think it's a moment where we all want something different. You can't come out of COVID and say you want to go back to the status quo. We all want to be in a place that makes all of us belong. And I think that's where some of that training has been really helpful. And, in terms of our work, we're very, very, aware of the fact that, caste exists across all immigrants who are from many South Asian countries of origin, and across all of these other regional places where there are systems of discrimination based on work and descent. I also think that we are also seeing it across many faith communities. And I'm someone who's of both Hindu and Christian descent. I have a parent and family from both sides of those faiths. And I'm a Buddhist now, So, and I've seen caste in all of those religious contexts. So, we want to be really clear, we are all for a multiracial, interfaith, and intercaste conversation that centers caste equity. We do not want to have any bigotry. And there is no group. The only people that are targeted by caste equity policies are people who are bigoted and discriminatory. Everyone else, like the addition of a protected category, doesn't harm any other communities, and that's and it's not really even a legal understanding, from people who are in the Department of Justice. So I just want to assure that oftentimes equity can feel like oppression to people that aren't used to sharing space with caste oppressed people and hearing caste oppressed people be able to use the language of the law to defend our rights. But that's not a conversation that should stop the flow of progress, but that is a really beautiful space to be able to have courageous conversations about the distress of the fragile, and how they might be able to use techniques like mindfulness to work on what is occurring for them that they're so stressed out that civil rights might be something that could trigger them in this way. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't have those conversations, but those conversations that help shape our cultures of belonging are separate from civil rights obligations. And right now, we need to be able to address the level of caste harm we're seeing. And the only way to do it is to add caste as a protected category and then move forward with competency trainings.
Thank you. We have 3 questions. One is from Mahima Buttar. What can students, specifically South Asian students, do to help bring awareness about caste oppression and break down these structures of oppression at the university? And the other 2 questions are, is caste part of every South Asian American's awareness or only present for more recent immigrants? Are all South Asians aware of caste discrimination the way all Jews are aware of anti-Semitism? How do people know to identify someone as Dalit? Meaning, how do others know to discriminate against Dalit people in the US?
Thank you, Darshana. And I'm going to pass it off to Thenmozhi for both. But I actually want to respond first and get to the 2 questions based on. I want to pick up on a point, an excellent point that Thenmozhi just made. When you think of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, you think about that ideal of a globalized world where everyone is born free and equal in dignity. That's the preamble. There isn't a religious, think about this, there's not a single world religion. If one religion says, hey, we can promote the equality better than the other, that's not true. There's not one world religion that exists today, however ancient they are, like Hinduism, that is not oppressing some religious minority or some minority defined, let's say indigenously, in one way or another. It cuts across in so many different directions. And to think about this question of passage and conversion, you think about the reservations that are put in place to help Dalits if they remain within Hinduism, which is in their case highly hierarchical and oppressive, but to remain to get, let's say, affirmative action and possibilities. But the second you convert out to another religion, like Christianity or Islam, you lose that. Well, what happens there is, I was reading a part of an advocacy group that sends me little clippings of what's happening throughout the world, and particularly in India, something in the news recently about a Christian bishop saying that intercaste marriage is a sin. So here's the justification of the perpetuation of caste, the horror of caste discrimination and oppression, but coming from his particular vantage point. So we need to go below religion, in other words. It's not about attacking religion, as I said from the beginning. When I think of the analogy to race, is caste part of every South Asian American's race? Let's think about this. You can say that some people are not aware. Some people erase, change their name, change their identity, become a new person. Some people erase the trace of it. Others know about it, refuse to speak about it. So how will you ever know? Is it ever part of someone's life? Today in America, we're thinking about anti-racism and white allyship. White liberals, white conservatives. It's not about politics. This is about anyone who cares about anti-racism. Let's say you're part of the white majority. And let me specify, non-quote unquote Hispanic, I'll use that term, non-Latinx whiteness from Europe. And you say, well, okay, I don't see racism and I want to fight against it. I'm colorblind. Self-reflexive mindfulness, Thenmozhi is saying, is to also understand your own white privilege and your ability to say that. That sounds like a contradiction. I'm not a racist. No. I get along with BIPOC and my friends and whatnot. That doesn't mean that you accrue from the macro level to the micro level a series of daily privileges that are not afforded to BIPOC. So when we take on this question of self-awareness, you might say that, well, even if I'm not aware of the caste, can there be caste color blindness, caste blindness, and the perpetuation of caste discrimination? Of course. So that raises the issue of responsibility. As for number two, how do people know to identify someone as Dalit? Meaning how others know to discriminate against Dalit. There are various mechanisms by which that occurs. I'm going to defer to Thenmozhi, who can give us some very concrete ideas of what that, how does that occur? But it's not a question of how do you know to discriminate. The question is, you might think, okay, how do I know, if you're asking in that respect, how do I know not to be offensive? The real issue is what happens when there is some disclosure of caste and then there are consequences of that. So in other words, I bring it back to the analogy of race again, critical race theory. One of the things about critical race theory is if the old traditional law, not the old, because it's still the dominant liberal utilitarian model of law in this country and the way law is taught, which is why BIPOC critical race theorists had to raise their voices up against that, is incomplete, fundamentally incomplete when we think about our legal system. Is that if you focus on intent, the intent to cause harm, yeah, there's going to be a lot of issues that you focus there, but what's called the disparate effect or impact, it's unintended effects of harm that are also crucially important. That's what we have to understand. When is it when someone is intending the harm, but also unintentional? What's an unintentional harm? The boasting of one's caste. If you're an upper privileged, upper caste person and you pull it out of the person, the second, third generation American, I'm a Brahmin. I'm quoting somebody, that's not me, but that is in a way ushering in the whole system of hierarchy that is positively demonizing, alienating others that don't get to participate in that level of privilege. The analogy to race collapses because unless you're a white supremacist, meaning bona fide white nationalist, if not a neo-Nazi, you go around saying, I'm proud of being white. Most white people I know, whether they're conservative or central or liberal or progressive, they don't go around saying that. So similarly, not all upper castes go around, at least in the American context, and quite frankly, it's a much more complex situation in India. Let's just talk about this context. If you don't hear it or don't see it, what happens in the course of a series of conversations, which is what happens to us second generation when we grow up here. At some point, you're forced to engage in the conversation. And it is terrifying. It is that Du Boisian veil that goes up, that moment that you feel like a group of people have monopolized a sense of prestige and power, and they enjoy that space, and they cavort with one another, and then you're made to feel less. So at some point, and this may be a long-winded way of saying, well, what do you mean concretely? For me, I'll speak personally, the issue, give it enough time, it comes up. How it comes up, I'm going to defer to Thenmozhi's amazingly deep experience historically with these issues.
Thank you for that. And I think, that's a very interesting question. I think that when you're a part of a protected category, it's not easy to be self-aware all the time. We have many, stories of, people who came into racial consciousness who did not have access to their histories, or, I'm thinking, particularly, when we're talking about the Midwest, when we think about the really tragic and very despicable history of Indigenous boarding schools and the ways that Indigenous children were specifically forced to, lose their language, lose their connection to their tribal identities as part of assimilation. And I think that, while not every Dalit person has as clear of an experience of their own caste background, because of how much punishing exclusion has done to basically dehumanize us and disconnect us from our own historical legacies and language, even of the terrain of our own oppression, there is growing confidence in our community to come forward, especially when we're able to create platforms of anonymity to be able to support folks to come forward without reprisal and violence. So, and I think that, no community has 100% consciousness, even, our colleagues who are from the Jewish tradition, you also have many stories of Jews that came into their own communities. And I'm always, touched by, I don't know if you guys know this history, but, because of the Spanish Inquisition, there was a tremendous amount of Jews that left, left Europe and Spain, and some of them went to Mexico. And because Mexico was a Catholic country and they were concerned about further recrimination as Jews, they became what is called crypto Jews, where they had crucifixes and other shrines of Christianity, and you would open up the crucifix and inside would be a Star of David. So they were able to maintain their traditions, but had to do so under the cover of, an alias, religious alias, as it were. And I think similarly, many Dalits live in this place of dual consciousness, where we know who we are. We also know it's not safe in many institutions to be out. And so, the fact that even many Dalits use the term "I'm coming out" is because of how much fear there exists. And my job as someone who's a civil rights leader, as someone who's also deeply committed to human liberation, is that I want to live in a world where Dalit children can be happy to be Dalit or not be Dalit. I want them to know that, we can be able to be whoever we want, and we can go to school and talk about the lineages of history and resilience that we come from, and we're not going to be censored or shamed or harmed. I want to be just like everybody else. And I wasn't given that right when I went to school. I went to UC Berkeley and faced a lot of caste discrimination. And, the only reason I'm here to tell my experience is because other women of color thinkers and leaders and community organizers held my hand and gave me space and let me, be under their shade of protection until I could be able to feel confident in my own voice. And the thing is that I think those were incredibly generous acts of empathy. But again, UC Berkeley did not fulfill its civil rights obligations for me to go to a school free from discrimination. And here we are, X amount of years later, we're still talking about similar harm that Dalit students and faculty and other stakeholders like staff are facing. And we know better. We know what happens when we don't talk about discrimination. We get severe harm. And so I think that, we need to move past the "does it exist" conversation. It exists. Now, what are we going to do to limit our liability and create a safe and inclusive campus at all? That barrier that we're talking about, we don't need to have Dalit bodies on the floor bleeding before we act. We can act so that we can make our campus inclusive right now. And it's what we've done in education in terms of every other protected category. When trans children and trans students were asking for protections, even though, it's protected under other categories, it was very clear that this community was facing so much harm that there needed to be explicitness in terms of policy. We are at that place with Dalit people right now. And so we just need to be able to work together to make this happen. And I know that we will. Even the fact that we had such a courageous and wonderful conversation together here really shows me that this campus is ready to take this, powerful leap for civil rights together.
Thank you so much. Dr. Sampath, do you have any closing remarks to make before we wrap up?
Maybe not closing remarks. I can put it back to you, Darshana, and the group.
No, you had some follow-up responses.
Yeah, just to what Thenmozhi was saying, because it really inspired me about in response to the question that just came up. When you think of the relationships between anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and casteism, you think about the variation here and the commonalities. That's why I like to think about intersectionality and solidarity. Within the Jewish population, the world Jewish population, there's already diversity, and it gets quote unquote racialized in different ways. But there's a collective experience of anti-Semitism. So in other words, there are Ashkenazi Jews, obviously of European origin, may not be constructed as white Gentile categories, and of course have suffered for so long, 2 millennia, all the way through 1945, the Holocaust and beyond, at the fate of white supremacy and neo-Nazism. So think about how horrific that is. And yet it's not about a question of race per se, in terms of the physicality of race. It's about being othered. If you say Islamophobia is reducible to one part of the world, it's the fastest growing religion in the world, and maybe will surpass Christianity. 4 regions around the world. India and China have the 2 largest populations. India and Indonesia, sorry, 2 largest populations. But think about so many different places where Muslims are othered. Such varied racial diversity, if you may talk about race. And yet at some point, there's some othering that takes place. There's tremendous oppression. Think about the Rohingya and Myanmar. And so similarly with caste and casteism, if you say, well, it's India and South Asia as a block, and you think about the global diaspora, you may not be able to detect or see the casteism if you say you're not from within that world or that community. And as such, unlike me and Thenmozhi, you weren't born into a caste. And well, the question is, it's not about visualizing what it looks like, but understanding that, first of all, not even a leap of faith, but understanding that when someone says it exists, this is the pain, I think, Thenmozhi, I'd like to get your perspective. The pain is to try to, burden of proof is on us to say that this exists. I don't know, what are you talking about? Or it disappeared a long time ago, or I thought we got rid of it. Well, the analogy again is, those other isms I mentioned, they haven't disappeared. And the scary thing is that they haven't disappeared in Western democracies. Very little you can do in dictatorships and authoritarian regimes that oppress their minorities. Very difficult. UN intervention notwithstanding. Or war, which we're seeing horrifically unfold right now. But when it occurs in Western democracies, then it is incumbent upon us to fight for civil rights. That's what I want to say.
Thank you so much. So Thenmozhi, if you have any closing remarks, because we are coming to the end of the session. And thanks once again for such a generative conversation. We have a lot to learn and also to think about what will be the right course of action. I'm sure that, all the students and faculty and staff who have attended this session have a lot to take away from this, and also to think about how to be good allies and support us in making this happen, because this is not just the sole responsibility of YSEG. I personally think that this is like a collective effort where we need support and solidarity from everyone, because we are standing for a rightful cause. And the least one could do is to actually offer hand and be with us in making caste a protected category. So if you have any last closing remarks to make, we can wrap up with that.
Sure. Well, I think one of the things I would love to do is to just thank you and all of the students that have been working so tirelessly on the issue of caste equity. Caste, because it's so taboo and there's so much violence surrounding caste, is terrifying to work on. And I think that the fact that you guys have been those courageous, first lines of articulation, that to me, I'm so grateful to you as someone who was a Dalit student that faced discrimination on my campus. I did not have those people on the campuses that I went to. And I think about all of the other future Thenmozhis and other Dalit students that will benefit from the work and the courage that you guys have started. I think that's so incredible. And, we know that, democracy is one of the most critical things that we can defend. And as we all kind of sit and watch and pray for Ukraine, we know that it's the courage of everyday people like yourselves that actually sustain the movement for civil rights and equity that we all hold dear, and have really made the United States a place where we can, hopefully start to have the laws actually reflect its promise to all peoples. We've actually had that promise deferred for many decades for many BIPOC communities. But as we come into alliance about wanting to have campuses that really reflect who we are and help us come out of COVID in a way where we're really in alignment with our values and building the world that we really want to live in, you know, I just really want to encourage people to lean into this conversation with empathy, with compassion, and with grace, you know, because courageous conversations are hard, but, you know, it's not hard to want to stop oppression. It's not hard to want to be on the right side of this conversation and to not give in to fear that is like the foundation of so much bigotry, but to hold the door open for possibility and for care with each other. And ultimately, I think, you know, when you guys win and get Caste as a protected category, I can't wait to see all of the Dalit students that are able to be their full selves. And, you know, for the folks that are part of this conversation who can help make this, you know, that decision a little bit easier, you know, we're happy to sit with you. I also would really love to encourage the South Asian Studies Department to consider adding Caste as a protected category, because again, as someone whose work is in South Asian Studies, many Dalit scholars, many Dalit students who work on the issue of caste don't often feel safe in their department when they don't know that caste is made explicit. And that's why so many South Asian Studies departments are often the forerunners of adding caste as a protected category, because you are the area experts. And, you know, particularly given the role of the South Asian Studies Conference that happens there every year, it's an important process that we can all work together on. And so I just look forward to the win. I look forward to the conversations and policy shifts that are happening, and just want to encourage people to move forward with love and dignity, because that is the heart of the Dalit civil rights movement. And as we always say when we close our meetings, we say this phrase, Jai Bhim, which is a salutation, you know, leading back to Dr. Ambedkar, but also the incredible joy and freedom you feel when you are greeting each other with justice and equity. So Jai Bhim to everybody, and thank you so much for this space.
JB.